Hey there. We're going to take a look at how we can render server-side components with Eleventy. Now, server-side components, it's a little bit of a weird concept, right? Well, in reality, they've been around for a long time. We're just used to, nowadays, we talk more about components on the client side of things. So what I want to take a look at today here are three different methods that we can take where we can achieve kind of building out a component-driven site using Eleventy. And these are server-side components because ultimately Eleventy will take the code we write, compile it down to just static HTML and CSS. Well, let's dive right in. Our first two examples are going to use templating languages that Eleventy just supports out of the box. We'll take a really simple approach to get started. So this will be we'll call this method one. We're going to just use template includes files. Now, I've got this web page, the Eleventy documentation pulled up here, and you can see that out of the box, Eleventy supports a number of different templating languages. Today, we're going to take a look at Nunchucks, which is kind of similar to Liquid. Both of those have this concept of includes. A few of these others do as well, but we're going to stick to Nunchucks. And just know here that your mileage may vary depending on what templating language you choose. But our first two examples here show us that right out of the box, if we use one of the languages that support this idea of includes, that we have a really quick and easy way to build out a server-side component system. So in this example, let's use Nunchucks and let's dive right in. Okay, well, let's get started. You see, I have an empty directory to start with. There's nothing in here. I've got the command line open, and then also I've got VS Code pulled up. There are no files in here. So let's get started by actually creating a file. I'm going to add a package.json file and just make it an empty object. And then you don't have to do this. If you read the Eleventy docs, you can get started without actually installing anything. I like to keep everything nice and packaged up in my project. So I'm going to say npm install, and then it's at 11ty, so the shorthand for Eleventy, and then Eleventy spelled out. And this is how we will add that package into our project. Okay, and when that's ready to go, you'll see that the dependency has been added to the package.json file. Now, we don't technically have to add anything else here, but I tend to start my Eleventy projects out by then adding a scripts section here, a script to be able to run that development server. I find that it's nice to just have a shorthand to boot up the server. So I'm going to add a script I'm going to call dev, and the command will be eleventy-serve. Okay, I saved that file, and now I should be able to come over to my command line and do npm run dev, and that will boot up the Eleventy server. So now if I go to localhost 8080, I'll actually have the server running, but I don't have anything there. So what do I have to do? Well, we got to add a page first. So in here, let's go ahead and add a page. And like I said in the intro, we're going to use Nunchucks as our example. So we're going to call this index.njk. And we'll just put in, why don't we just put in some boilerplate code? Well, for now, actually, let's just say hi. And we'll notice that we should then end up with an index page over here. And we do. We've got what we need. So great. Okay. Now we should probably add some boilerplate here, right? So we'll make this HTML5 and just say Eleventy server side components. And we've got some placeholder content, and now if I refresh this page, boom, I'm in great shape, okay? Perfect. All right, so our first method here is we're gonna use very basic template includes files. Now the Nunchucks templating language here supports this shortcode called include, and include will then load any other files we have in the includes directory. So in our example here, let's build out a button. Okay, so what I really want to do here is I want to say include button.njk, save that, and actually I'm going to change this back to clean this up a little bit here. All right, now if you're following the command line down here, you'll see that I've got an error. What happened? Well, it said we're having trouble rendering the template because we couldn't find the button template. Great. So what do we need to do? Well, we want to create a folder for our to hold our includes files. So we'll call that underscore includes, which is that's the default setting in Eleventy. You can change that if you want to, but right out of the box, that's what we're looking for. And then button.njk was the file we were trying to find. So I'm going to say I am a button here, save that. And notice the server picked it right back up, and boom, we've got a button. Okay, so what should the button really be though? The button should probably be some sort of anchor tag, right? Something like that. All right, there we go. We've got what we should have, and we're rendering a button on screen. So this in itself is the simplest example, right? We've got this piece of code here that is reusable, and we can use it anywhere on the site. And so that in essence is a component. However, it's not really a great real world scenario, right? Because, well, that you don't want to have to create a new type of button every time you want a new or a different href attribute or different text in there, right? We want to be able to configure what those are when we render the button. So with nunjucks, we can expect a variable, say URL will be our href variable, and then we'll call maybe what's inside the button, what gets rendered to the screen, we'll call it the label. Now, if we save this, what'll happen? We didn't get an error because all the files are where they're supposed to be, but it disappeared. All right, but if we take a look here, and we're kind of fighting for space over here, but let's just see if we can find what we're looking for, that we've got hello world, and we do actually have the button there. It's just there was no value for URL or label, so it didn't render anything. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we need to set URL and label. So what we can do is we can use the set method from nunjucks and say set URL. We'll just point it to our home page, and then label will be click me. Save that, and boom, we're back. We got the same value we did before. Now, that's okay. That works. But does it feel weird? It feels weird to me. The reason it feels a little bit weird is that, one, that's a lot of writing. That's a lot of different nunjucks tags just to render one button. Two, what we're doing when we say set URL and set label is we're setting globally available variables. And so it can be really difficult to debug, because if we use URL in different contexts throughout different templates and we start chaining templates together and all this stuff, it can be really difficult to find where did that value of URL get set. So one thing we could do to improve just slightly is we could say, well, what if that object what if we pass an object in rather than just individual attributes? Well, let's say our object were called component. So we could say component.url and component.label, and we'll go back to having nothing on screen here, even though we've still got that anchor tag physically there. And then we could set our variable here to component, and we could make this a JavaScript object. So URL and label, and we'll just be consistent. Why not? All right, now if I save that, we're back. We're back in business, right? That's great. We still kind of have a similar issue here where we're setting component. We have to set a variable before we actually include the template. It works, and it's cool because it works right out of the box, but it's verbose, it's tiresome. You build a big application out with this approach, and it's just eventually it's going to be really frustrating. So that brings me to my second approach, which is template shortcodes. Eleventy has this concept of shortcodes where we could say include as a shortcode. We can add other code here, that we can then customize what that actually does, how that resolves behind the scene by writing some JavaScript. In other words, where I want to get to is, instead of saying this, I want to just be able to do something like button and then be able to pass those attributes directly. So URL and label. and have that work. Now, if I save this, it's going to crap out on me, right? Because, well, that tag, button, that shortcode, it doesn't exist anywhere. So we have to actually write the logic for button. What is button supposed to do? We got to tell Eleventy what it is. We're going to put that logic inside of the main Eleventy configuration file, which is whoops, I'm going to be over here, .eleventy.js. Now, the way this file works is the main export here can be a function, and that function can return some configuration object, but then above the return statement that's where you can manipulate all the inner workings of Eleventy. And so this function actually does receive an argument. It's called Eleventy config. And we can use Eleventy config to do a bunch of different stuff here. So why don't we just start here by logging what this is. We won't spend too much time on this, but if I do that, and then let's see if we actually, if we kill the server and start over, we still have our error, but notice we've got this big old user config object here, and we got tons of stuff we can do with it. Okay, so let's kind of run through this here. Well, what we want to do is we want to add a shortcode for button. In this example, we're just going to add it directly to the nunjux language. You could add a generic one, but we're gonna be specific to nunjux. So we're going to say Eleventy config dot add nunjux shortcode, and the first argument here, or first parameter, is the name of the shortcode, which we called button, and the second is the function that should resolve based on the input there. And so what we pass to button comes in as the arguments to this function. So I'm just gonna, keeping in JavaScript lingo, I'm gonna call them props, and then we've got ourselves a function, and whatever we return here will be the value that will be the code, I guess, that the actual HTML code that gets rendered to the screen. So if I said just 1, 2, 3, for example, and then I come back and restart my server, now I don't have an error. And what do we have up here? Well, just 1, 2, 3, right? We've lost our button. So what we really want to do up here is we want to read the button file, that template file, or that component file, pass it the props, and then render the result. Okay, so to do that, we're actually going to need the nunjux library. Now, Eleventy should bring that by default, but I like to be safe, so I'm going to say npm install nunjux. And while that's running, let's jump back over here, and we're going to add our dependencies. We're going to work with the fs, or file system library from Node. We're also going to work with the path library, and then we will use nunjux as well. So what we want to do is we want to be able to grab, the first thing we want to do is grab the actual, find the path to the file for the button. So we can do that by saying, we'll just call it file path, and there's a join method on path. And if we do dir name resolves to where we are located. And then we can say includes and button.njk. Now, I usually like to put in some safety valves here. And so what I'll say is, if the file doesn't exist, we want to just not return anything, right? You might want to throw an error or something like that, but I'm going to say if fs dot, you can say exists sync, and and then we'll pass it the file path. We'll say return, well, why don't we just say it does not exist, and we can see what happens here. So if I save this, and then I come back and restart my server, save this, I still have 1, 2, 3 because that file does exist. Now, if I gave it the wrong name, let's say, we say does not exist. So that's one way to have kind of our fail-safe here. So I'm gonna change that back to an empty string, fix my method here, and we should go back to 1, 2, 3. Okay, but now we know that file exists, and so let's read it. So we'll say content here is fs.readFileSync, and we'll give it our file path. And then we're going to say toString. And that should give us a string of the actual content. If you want, I can log what we have as the output here. And here it is popped down here. So that's the physically, that is the actual static content that is sitting inside this file, right? It's not resolved or anything like that. So now we've got this string, and we can run that string through nunjuck's render method and actually get the result back. And that's fairly straightforward. We say nunjucks.render, and if we pass nothing else to it, we just have to give it the content first. So what we'll say is, why don't we return that value? Now what's going to happen? Oh, we got an error. Why do we have an error? Because we have template not found. Well, we're actually having an issue here because we haven't set component, right? So let's do that. So the second argument here, if we look at the render method and our helper here, is the context. So what variables are we actually sending to that template? Well, we know we wanted a component object, and that the component object would have URL and label. But if we're just not, if we're a little bit looser about it, we could just say component and then pass it the props, which are those items that came into this method, which we're moving back up the chain, we get to our index file. That means that is URL and label. So let's save that and see if that works for us. Oh, and we're still having an issue, and that is because I used the wrong method. Okay, it's not render, it's render string. All right, so let's try that. There we go. Okay. Now we're back to having click me on page, and let's just make sure we're working. Let's change it to something else. Boom, there we go. We've got it. And so you can take that approach and that's much, much more powerful, right? We're doing this all in one line. My formatter is being real goofy, but for the most part, we're doing this all in one line. That's super powerful, right? Now you could take it even a step further, and I have taken it further on my personal site and a few other sites where instead of doing this and saying, well, I'm going to write a method for every single component, well, that gets tedious, right? Because a lot of sites can have dozens to hundreds of components, and you don't want to have to write a new shortcode every time. And so you could think about, how could you abstract this? Well, you could have a shortcode that's just component, and that component takes an argument that is the name of that component and then goes and loads the file dynamically. Or you could get out ahead of that and say, well, I don't want to say my shortcode is component. I want it to actually write these methods on the fly. And so you could have some sort of loop in here where you looked at all of the content within some directory and includes, read them all, and then wrote the shortcodes dynamically. I'm not going to cover that now. That's pretty intense. So if it doesn't make sense, that's fine. This is just kind of step one. It's a way to do it. It's a way to have kind of a component driven sort of approach, to have some reusable code that powers your site. Now, before we move on to step 3, there's a big gotcha here. And that gotcha is that the big downside to this approach is when I do this and I say nunjucks.renderString, well, all of a sudden I have created my new ecosystem, my new environment in which I'm rendering that content. That means that anything else that I have configured within this application for Eleventy, it's gone, right? It's like, in other words, if I add a button shortcode here, and then I add a shortcode for, say, header or something like that. Well, then if I were to, let's say, for example, I were to add another shortcode that was, let's call it header, right? And there's some code in here, something like that. Then that works out here, right? I can do header, blah, blah, blah. The problem is, what if I also then want to use that in here and say header and render that header? So in other words, nesting components within one another. Well, it doesn't really work that way. We'd have to redefine them and redefine them again. And so that, to me, that is kind of a blocker. It's kind of a wall that I've run into in the past. I've had some creative ways around it. So your mileage may vary in this approach, but on a simplistic term and the way to keep a site organized, it's a great way to get started, at least. All right, now the third and final approach, I'm not actually going to write any code for, but I'm going to tell you that I started off by talking about server-side components being like kind of an old idea, these template sort of languages and concocting them into components. And it feels like sort of in contrast to where the web has gone in the last decade or so, looking more towards client-side components, using frameworks like React and Vue. Well, those are, they're on the client side. And one of the big benefits to using Eleventy is that you're actually rendering static HTML so you can be super speedy when the page loads. But that said, there are methods in both React, Vue, and other client-side JavaScript libraries where you can render the components to static HTML. And this is a very new, it's a newer concept, and it's especially a newer concept as it relates to Eleventy. Some other frameworks have supported it for years. Next introduced it this year. Gatsby, that's kind of one of the foundational elements to Gatsby, so it's been around for several years. Nuxt does the same thing with Vue. So I'm going to pull up my browser again here, and so I'm not going to write any code here because there is this great article on Netlify's website about how they revamped netlify.com using Eleventy and Vue, and they use Vue to organize their site into components. The really cool and clever thing here is that they're using Vue only on the server side. So they're organizing the site much in the same way we are here, but they're using this library that is already built to be kind of component first and focused on components. Now, before I sign off, I want to talk about the last big gotcha here, both in any one of these three approaches, including this Vue approach, including the approach that some other folks are taking with trying to get React to work with Eleventy, and that is that this is all happening server side. So this whole process, all this stuff, is taking components, some sort of templated markup, and compiling it down to static HTML. And then when the page loads, there's no client-side JavaScript that is connected to it, even if you're using something like Vue and React, that for the most part, they're just focused on, as it relates to Eleventy, again, building static HTML. So that means things like CSS and client-side JavaScript are then separate. So you still need a different mechanism, a different system to generate client-side JavaScript, and probably also style sheets as well. So that is to say, this is a new concept. It's a powerful concept, but we're at the beginning. That's something that is going to continue to build. So this is a great foundational way to keep your Eleventy sites nice and buttoned up and organized. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm Sean C. Davis. You can find me on Twitter, Sean C. Davis 29. If you have any questions or you want to give me some feedback or just share how you've gotten components to work in your Eleventy project, I would love to chat with you. Until then, I'll see you next time.